there's definitely a risk-reward trade-off. If you take the risk and you go first, then you might be the one with the largest reserve. But it takes a lot of foresight or understanding or a strong personality to be able to make that sort of thing happen. But I understand the frustration. Like, for a lot of Bitcoiners, we see the solution and it's so obvious. But I think another dimension to it is you'd have to basically admit everything is a failure to make that jump to Bitcoin, right? And it's going to be the same thing for strategic Bitcoin reserves. You're going to probably have the US go first, and they start accumulating, and then discourse starts happening in other places, and then they decide, okay, we're going to do it. Well, it's really tricky to make people understand Bitcoin because there is a lack of understanding of money itself. Yeah. And I think that has to do with a lot of people being born into a world of fiat money. So everyone that is born after 1971, they really have no idea about what sound money is. They've grown up in this world of fiat money printing and inflation, and in a lot of cases hyperinflation. So they just don't know anything else. So it's a doubly hard problem to solve because first you have to hope they understand money, and then second, teach them about Bitcoin. So I like the example of presenting Bitcoin as digital gold because there is more basis for understanding, commonality of understanding of hard money from that perspective. But I think it's not really necessary to get people to fully understand Bitcoin, as long as they understand the benefits of Bitcoin and that there is a competition to acquire Bitcoin. So we try not to get too much into the nuts and bolts of it. We don't go into a meeting with governments and say, hey, there's 21 million, it's sound money, and if you don't adopt it, you're going to have fun staying poor, or anything like that. We try to come at it from what are you interested in? Yeah. So as an example, we met with the president of Colombia, and he's interested in hitting emissions targets. And you can do that with Bitcoin mining and reducing flared gas or tapping into methane from landfills and whatnot. So that was how we approached it. It was not really from a monetary perspective or even a legal tender perspective, but we try to find out what they are interested in and work from that angle. But if you have the US in the mix, and the US has about, I think, 190,000 Bitcoin or so, and they are actively acquiring more, maybe a significant portion of new Bitcoin produced each day by miners, I think that would be a strong indicator. And there is precedent for this type of follow-on or FOMO, which is the ETFs. So the US ETFs launched first. And I know that the regulators and a lot of the issuers in Hong Kong were waiting for that signal. They didn't want to be the first. It's always risk. They don't want to be out on a limb in case it doesn't work. And in Australia, there's Monochrome. I'm an investor in Monochrome, just as a disclosure. But they were also briefing me on the situation, and it's also waiting on the regulator, which was waiting on the SEC in the US. Now, in a world without scarcity and without the finiteness of Bitcoin, maybe that's okay. But if you factor in there's a cap of 21 million and that the amount of Bitcoin available is incredibly limited, it really changes the dynamic. So the US ETFs now hold 960,000 coins, 960,000 BTC. Hong Kong, maybe 10, 15,000. Australia, 100 something. So you can see like it's taking almost 2 zeros off when you go to Hong Kong and another 2 zeros to get to Australia. And it's directly in sequence of adoption. So US first, then Hong Kong, then Australia. And it's going to be the same thing for strategic Bitcoin reserves. You're going to probably have the US go first, and they start accumulating, and then discourse starts happening in other places, and then they decide, okay, we're going to do it. But the danger of that is you're going to wind up with like 100 coins in your Bitcoin reserve, and they're going to have the lion's share. So there's definitely a risk-reward trade-off. If you take the risk and you go first, then you might be the one with the largest reserve. But it takes a lot of foresight or understanding or a strong personality to be able to make that sort of thing happen.
From your perspective, I mean, how would you define nation-state Bitcoin adoption? And does that extend downwards into just normal people using it every day, or are we, at Jan 3, are you focused much more on that higher level?
So ideally, we focus on both levels. That's why we have engagement at the top with governments, and then at the grassroots level, we're trying to roll out Aqua. And we've just decided a few months ago that Argentina will be a big focus of ours for Aqua. So we're actively brainstorming of how to get there on that front. But I would say nation-state adoption can be a number of things. Legal tender is one, or just embracing Bitcoin to be money. So if there is no capital gains tax, you can simply just say, we're welcoming Bitcoin now. But there's a number of clever ways to go about that sort of Bitcoin adoption as money. The second one I would say is doing something like a financialization around Bitcoin, such as a Bitcoin bond. So issuing sovereign debt backed by Bitcoin, and that's effectively taking the MicroStrategy playbook and applying it to countries. And to me, it's a no-brainer. And I think for El Salvador, they also saw it the same way because the president agreed to do that. The third would be probably just mining Bitcoin, using Bitcoin as a sort of monetary battery and taking advantage of energy reserves that would otherwise be untapped. But you could also do all three.
I mean, what is the issue here, given that the demand generally is still for US dollars or some other fiat currency? I mean, do you see a mechanism in there for, I don't know, getting people to understand, is it incentives? Like, why are they not flocking to Aqua and to Bitcoin and to all of these things that are already available?
Unfortunately, I think it's just they don't see what's right in front of them. They don't see the solution to the problem. And a lot of it has to do with just the ingrained, embedded nature of fiat money into their whole fabric of being. To make that jump is sort of awakening yourself from the matrix without the intervention of Morpheus or anyone else. So that does happen, but that's not the norm. So they can look at all the problems and they can see that there is a problem, but they just cannot make that last step into the Bitcoin solution. And I think this is why many countries end up trying to dollarize. If you look at Argentina, they've kind of gone down that path, but more of a dollarization by market forces and deregulation. And at the same time, they're subtly encouraging Bitcoin adoption too. But there are many more factors at play, obviously. There are the supranational organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, who also have some sway in this, a lot of sway in this in some cases, right? So I believe for Argentina, they don't want to rock the boat yet until they've settled things with the IMF for the next set of loans. But we actively see some sort of meddling from that side. So we were in Suriname, we were very far down the discussions with the central bank there to just allocate 1% of the reserves to Bitcoin. And we actually went there to meet with them, sat with them in a room. And I think a week later, the World Bank went to visit, and then they just went radio silent. So, you have to kind of add one and one at that point and wonder, are there counter forces to what we are trying to do at Jan 3 or even other Bitcoiners to fight against the adoption of Bitcoin? But I understand the frustration. Like for a lot of Bitcoiners, we see the solution and it's so obvious. But I think another dimension to it is you'd have to basically admit everything is a failure to make that jump to Bitcoin, right? So if you're, the president of Turkey or the central bank of Turkey, to do that, you kind of have to admit defeat, right? To make that full leap into a Bitcoin standard. This is why when we engage with central banks, we propose something modest, like just put 1% into Bitcoin. If you think there's a 1% chance Bitcoin will become the reserve asset of the world or the money of the future, then you should allocate 1% to Bitcoin. And so far, we haven't seen it yet, but I think that's a reasonable, cautious way for them to dip their toes into Bitcoin. And once they start to get into it, I believe they will keep on going, because once your eyes have been opened, you can't really close them again to the potential of Bitcoin to fix so many things.
Strategic reserves, etc. Certainly there's a lot of concern that basically Coinbase is custodying everyone's Bitcoin. Do you have, an official line with Jan 3 around how you approach the idea of self-custody at scale? If we're talking about nation state, how do you like to see them engage with Bitcoin?
Well, it's complicated. So at that sort of scale, maybe it makes sense for them to start with a custodian. because it's simpler. There's also an element of risk, not for the country losing its keys, but more for theft. Because a lot of these countries that might look to adopt Bitcoin, somebody might steal it in the administration of the government. So you also need to consider that. And at least with a custodian, there's a series of more checks and balances that are more anchored to the legacy system, which they are familiar with dealing with. But let's just say you have a multi-sig wallet. The president of that country has a key, the minister of finance has a key, and someone else has another key. Two of them couldn't collude and steal the entire country's Bitcoin holdings, right? And some of these countries may be prone to that, right? Maybe in other areas of global south, like Africa, right? It's kind of a free-for-all still. So I see a place for custodians, but then you should probably graduate to self-custody after some time, which I think El Salvador did do. I believe they were using a custodian at first, and then the president announced now we have all the keys in a multi-sig in El Salvador.
And do you know, just on a technical level, whether there is advisory and, I guess, support for something like that? I mean, things that would be suitable for a government to use, not just a ledger in the back room sort of thing.
Yeah, that's something that Jan 3 can definitely help with.
I see.
I did help draft a proposal early on, like before the Bitcoin law came into effect. Like, this is how you should do your cold storage setup in El Salvador. But it really depends on the country, and you have to work with them to determine where keys are stored, some in the country, maybe some outside of the country. But I was thinking the hardware wallet is like a higher layer. So the actual key material is at a more base layer of storage, which is not accessed very commonly. It would be the hardware wallet layer that would generate a deposit address. But generally, you don't really need to spend the Bitcoin. So just plan for only accumulating the Bitcoin.